full house, and I think we're just about to start. Andrew's ready. He's been ready for quite a while now. The Battle of Isandlwana was 22nd of January 1879. Was one of the most dramatic episodes in the military history. And in the morning, 20,000 Zulus overwhelmed the British invading force in one of the greatest disasters ever to befall the British Army. I'm not going to go any further because Andrew will tell you the story, and he'll tell it very well because he lived it too, just as good, and that's exactly close by where it happened. So I'm going to hand you over to Andrew right away now.
Thank you, Lynn. I think that sums it up. So, I was thinking this morning. I think that might be a bit loud, yeah? No? The problem is it's loud for me. I'll soften it a little bit. I was thinking back on the 10 years that I worked actively at Fugitive Drift, walking these battlefields. And that reminded me that I haven't told this story for 5 years. So I think this is one of those ones, please keep your expectations low and your spirits high, and we're bound to have a good time. So a story without context is a pretty pointless exercise, I think, and I could spend an hour, perhaps more, just telling you about the reasons for the Anglo-Zulu War, and in the interest of keeping everyone awake, I'm going to do that relatively quickly. I hope everyone's got a basic understanding of early-ish South African history. But if one starts and looks at a map of South Africa, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but in the mid-1870s, the British had two colonies, the Cape Colony and the colony of Natal. The Boers had the Orange Free State, or the Republic of the Orange Free State, and the Republic of the Transvaal, just out of shot there. And then there was the independent sovereign territory of the Kingdom of Zululand. Now, the British started taking an active interest in South Africa at the time for a number of reasons. We start with the simple one, the sea route around the Cape. Sorry, I just did what you said we do. The sea route around the Cape. Obviously no Suez Canal in those days. Good farming land, cheap labour, wonderful climate, and then came the discovery of a woman's best friend. Diamonds. And when we chuckle, but it's true, isn't it? And you can see how prominently Kimberley features on the map over there. And so the British decided to do with South Africa what they had done with Canada in the late 1860s, and that is to confederate this country. And they presented the man who had successfully confederated Canada, Lord Carnarvon, with the South African problem. And interestingly enough, as a complete aside, Lord Carnarvon, his son, the 5th Earl, was to fund the expedition to Egypt that found the tomb of Tutankhamun. So all these names are all these people are really linked in global history as well. And the problem that Carnarvon envisaged was the independent sovereign territory of the Kingdom of Zululand. The Zulus were deemed to constitute a military threat to the British colony of Natal and the recently annexed Transvaal. And so he pulled a man out of retirement, a man who'd had an unbelievable career up until this point, and I think that's the lesson in this is that when one's had an unbelievable career and you've retired, don't go back. His name was Sir Henry Bartle Edward Frere. Now you're going to get a lot of names about this lot this evening. They really don't name their kids like they used to. And Bartle Frere decided that he needed to deal with the Zulu problem, and the issues in this country were as complex then as they are now. And so he and Lord Chelmsford, the second Baron Lord Chelmsford, Frederick Augustus Thesiger was his birth name, decided that they were going to issue the Zulus with an ultimatum, and that the policy of confederation could never come about while the Zulus were an independently operating military force within said territory. Now, the thrust of this ultimatum was that the Zulus would have to disband their army within 30 days, and if they failed to comply with it, the British would come and disband it for them. And the other issue that existed from Frere's point of view is that there'd been an exceptionally good diplomatic relationship between the Zulus in or at Ulundi and Pietermaritzburg, the capital of Natal. So now how do you issue an ultimatum to your friend? Not the easiest thing in the world to do. So what they did is Frere instructed his border agents and magistrates in the district along the Natal Zulu border over there to keep an eye out on said border and to see if they could find any instances where the integrity of that border had been impinged upon by Zulu activity. And of course, a number of such instances were found. Now, opposite Rorke's Drift in Zululand, there lived a famous chief called Sikhayo. Sikhayo kakongo ngobe se wamakunge. Now, if any of you could say that, you can get your ticket price back from me. Anyone want to have a go? No? And Sikhayo was a polygamist, many Zulus were, many Zulus still are. And in winter of 1878, he found that two of his wives were crossing the Buffalo River and cohabiting with their lover, Mswagele, who lived on the Natal bank of the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift. And in that same winter of 1878, when the river level is low and it's easy to ford, particularly if you can't swim, they dragged, two sons of Sikhayo, and one of them was the famous Mehloga Zulu, dragged these two delinquent wives through the shallows of the Buffalo, and on the Zulu bank of the Buffalo River, in full view of the missionary at Rorke's Drift and in full view of the Buffalo Border Guard, they were stoned to death. Now this incident and others were woven into the preamble of this ultimatum. The ultimatum was eventually issued to the Zulus on the 11th of December, 1878, and as I said, the thrust of it was that they'd have to disband their army within 30 days, and if they didn't, the British would come and do it for them. Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, was stunned at this ultimatum, and I want to make that clear right from the get-go, is that he did not want to go to war with the British. He liked having them as his neighbours to the south. It protected him from the Amaxhosa down here, and obviously, as I said, this brilliant relationship that existed at this point was now being disrupted. In fact, because they were brought to the ultimatum, and I'm digressing slightly off the task at hand, but I think it's important to put this into perspective. There was a boundary commission that, if anyone's interested, go and read it, that found in favour of the Zulus for this wedge of territory over there between the Buffalo River and the Blood River that the Boers had claimed was theirs after the defeat at Blood River. The Zulus obviously had tenure to that land, and now the British also had taken it over. And in a rather complicated situation after the annexation of the Transvaal, because the Boers maintained that wedge of territory there belonged to the Transvaal. Those Boers who now lived there, having been annexed by the British, were now British citizens. And that was the argument that the British had. But they had a commission that sat at Rorke's Drift in 1878, and it found in favour of the Zulus. And so in order to get the Zulus to come and listen to the ultimatum, they got them and said, we're going to read the findings of the Boundary Commission. And of course the findings were in favour of the Zulus. The Zulus were happy, oxen were slaughtered, they were plied with roast beef, and of course a little grog, no doubt to soften the blow that was coming. And then the ultimatum was delivered to the Zulus in the afternoon. And Cetshwayo famously said after the ultimatum, he wondered if this was the way that the Great White Queen, Queen Victoria, behaved towards her subjects. Did she give her children sweets in the morning and a hiding that same afternoon? He was also very anxious to convey to her that he loved her, which is quite remarkable considering what the British were intent on doing to them. And he couldn't understand why the great House of Britain was intent on falling in on him and his people. But he also sent a famous retort, and he said, go and tell the Great White Queen, and let her hear this well, that if she is intent on sending her red soldiers against me and my armies, she must know that my warriors are as numerous as the ants of this earth, and I will eat those red soldiers up. The die, of course, was cast. Unfortunately for Cetshwayo, though, he had no idea that this little island north of France had an essentially unlimited supply of British soldiers. But the British were pretty good at having military blunders in this country. Some of you may have heard of the Battle of Majuba, the Battle of Speenkop, and of course the Battle of Isandlwana. So if one looks at Natal in a slightly more zoomed in position, Chelmsford's plan on expiry of the ultimatum was that he was going to invade Zululand with 3 huge columns and 2 small columns. Now, one of the major columns, under the command of Colonel Charles Pearson, was to travel up the coast. They were promptly besieged at Eshowe for 11 weeks. Who would have thought that the Zulus would be able to do that to a modern British army? In fact, on the very day of the Battle of Isandlwana, at the Battle of Isandlwana, they put the Gatling gun to use for the first time in history. Column number 2 was a mini column under the command of Colonel Anthony William Durnford, Royal Engineer. Wonderful character was Anthony Durnford. He was very pro-Zulu, in fact sat on the Boundary Commission that found in favour of the Zulus and didn't want to go to war with the Zulus. He had a slightly checkered military past in the Drakensberg Mountains, but I won't go into that. I'll let you read up about it. It's a wonderful story. Then column column number 4 was another one of the major columns under the command of Colonel Evelyn Wood, VC. And then column number 5 was another little mini column under the command of Colonel Hugh Rowlands that was to make sure that the Swazis were kept out of this little fight that the British were intent on having with the Zulus. And then these columns, and I'm going to get to column number 3, I haven't left it out. I've left it out on purpose for now, but they were to converge on Urundi, driving the Zulus before them, and there he would smash them. That was Lord Chelmsford's plan. Now, column number 3, the largest of the 3, the big central column, which is the one that we're focused on this evening, was to come into Cetshwayo's territory from the middle over here. And it was under the command of a delightful, diminutive little man by the name of Richard Thomas Glynn. But Chelmsford and his staff accompanied this column. So not only is Chelmsford Commander-in-Chief, he's de facto column commander as well. So you're not going to hear any more about Glynn, I'm afraid, because Chelmsford is calling the shots. So they were to move from Pietermaritzburg, I can't quite read it there, but it goes over there, move up in a northerly direction, up onto the plateau, the Biggersberg, and then down to the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift. Now, is anyone unfamiliar with what a drift is? Until I'm talking to a lot of South Africans here. A natural ford on a river. And there's a particularly good one at Rorke's Drift. Now all these columns had to choose spots to cross the Buffalo River and the Tugela River at known fords. So you've got this one right down on the coast, then Durnford at the middle drift on the Tugela, Rorke's Drift, and then this was fairly easy to cross. There are a number of them, but Landman's Drift was the name of that one. And so Rorke's Drift is an interesting place. Has anyone ever been, actually? Just put myself under a bit of pressure here. For those who've actually been on site, hopefully we can semi-transport you back there. So up until this point, the Buffalo River is a big, slow, meandering stream. And here at Rorke's Drift it starts to cut its way down into the low country, into these deep gorges. And its first move in doing so is it slides over a series of sandstone shelves, which form the most magnificent series of natural causeways. It was a place where wagon wheels could get purchased even in the wet season when the river was running strongly, and that summer of 1878, 1879 was particularly wet. And Chelmsford arrived at Rorke's Drift, and he waited for the ultimatum to expire. The ultimatum, of course, expired at midnight on the 10th of January, 1879, and the next day the invasion of Zululand begins. Now, the backbone of this central column was made up of 2 battalions, the 24th Regiment of Foot, which was drawn from Brecon in Wales. Interesting aside, but we'll get to the Welsh connections, particularly for those coming to hear the follow-on from the story at Rorke's Drift. There's a bit of confusion in particular about the 24th Foot. Its barracks had moved to Brecon. It was actually known as the 2nd Warwickshire Regiment at the time. But of course, a lot of the newer recruits were Welshmen. A fair number of the 1st Battalion, who were much older men, were largely English, but the 2nd Battalion in particular had a very Welsh flavour to it. Another interesting little bit of this is that over half the force that Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand with were black. Mainly Zulu-speaking black people from Natal, who had an axe to grind against their North Tugela and North Buffalo River neighbours. And in a lot of this, believe it or not, lies the divide between the ANC and the IFP in this country. It's absolutely true. Most of the south side of the old Natal, as people would know it, was very pro-ANC, and obviously further north in Zululand, very pro-IFP. That's another long story. Now, on crossing the Buffalo River, Chelmsford decided to punish Schayo, the man who'd given Freer the pretext for the issuing of this ultimatum. And Schayo lived in a beautiful valley called the Bache. And around the eastern side of where his homestead was, it's bordered by a lofty set of blood-red cliffs puckered with caves. It's a wonderful horseshoe-shaped gorge. It's a magnificent natural stronghold. And what's the first thing you do when you cross your enemy's territory? You give them a bloody note, show them that you mean business, and hopefully this message gets back to the king. And the other thing that's really interesting about it is Chelmsford had prayed to God, and he wrote it in many letters back home, that he would get a chance to fight the Zulus in the open. His previous experience had been not too far from here. If you travel about 4 hours in an easterly direction into the Eastern Cape, bringing about a close to the Ninth Frontier War and the very difficult conditions in the Amatola Mountains and the prairie bush. And there it was very hit and run type tactics that the Amatola involved. Very difficult for an infantryman to fight back in terms of guerrilla warfare. So now the force selected to perform the task of destroying Schayo's homestead, Wasokhehle, means the cock's comb, named after these blood-red cliffs, was the large number of black soldiers. They were grouped into a corps called the Natal Native Contingent. They were poorly trained. In some instances, they weren't even trained at all. And they were rather poorly equipped, with only 1 rifle for every 10 men and only 5 cartridges per rifle. Many British officers regarded them to be more of a liability than an asset, and they were rather disparagingly referred to as being the untrained untrainables. Now, British officers were selected to lead the untrained NNC into this gorge, and one of them was a delightful youngster. His name was Henry Charles Harford. He was a naturalist. He kept a very lively little journal, which was very useful to my father in re-establishing our little game reserve. And this youngster had endeared himself in the preceding days to the British High Command at Rorke's Drift, because he leant across the mess table and helped himself to Major Cleary's gin, which he decanted off into a little jar, into which he was attempting to preserve his scorpions. And Charlie Harford voiced his concern and disgust at having to lead the untrained NNC into battle. He'd never been in battle before himself, and he complained to his superior, who was a rough diamond of a New Zealander by the name of Commandant George Maori Hamilton Brown. Okay, another one of these lovely names. And Maori Brown patted him on the head. He said, "Don't worry, Charlie, you'll be fine." And now please imagine the scene here. You've got an extremely jittery Charlie Harford leading a possibly more jittery NNC into this battle. It reads a bit like a Rider Haggard story. And as they were moving up into the valley, a Zulu shouted at them from a cave in perfect English. He said, "By whose orders do you come?" And an officer called Duncombe stood forth and shouted back a patent untruth. He said, "By the orders of the Great White Queen." Now, Queen Victoria at the time had no idea where Zululand was, or who the Zulus were. And it's also interesting, all of this takes place without the sanction of the central British government. It's a very important point to make. Freer and Chelmsford used long delays in telegraphic communication to ensure that the central British government was kept in the dark, and it's a pretty well agreed fact of history that if Sir Michael Hicks Beach had known that this was going on, he would never have allowed such a campaign to take place. Partly also because it was deemed to be inconvenient to the Crown to have 2 campaigns going on simultaneously. The British were busy with another war at the same time in Afghanistan. It wasn't going well back then, and it didn't go too well the next time round. Anyone know who the last man to win a war in Afghanistan was? No one? Genghis Khan. Don't go to war in Afghanistan. It's a bad idea. You're never going to win. Anyway, it becomes quite a heated skirmish in Schayo's stronghold, particularly as the warriors got into the boulders and the caves beneath the cliffs. And the British had some anxious moments, and it was at this point in this minor little skirmish or battle that Harford collapsed. And a cry went up in the gorge. It was, "Harford is killed, Harford is killed." Hamilton Brown hears the shout and he races off on horseback into the gorge, expecting to find Harford dead. And he finds this lunatic natural historian, this kid who'd expressed his fears about going into battle for the first time. He was on his hands and knees in the midst of battle, intent on transferring a rare beetle that he'd spotted into a matchbox. Such was the stuff of which this British Empire was made. Anyway, Harford puts the microbe into the box. Skyer's warriors are flushed from the caves. The British force moved up the Bache River Valley. They destroyed his homestead. They captured his livestock. They killed his son. Mkumbi Zulu was dead. And Lord Chelmsford turned to his staff officers and he said, "You see, it's going to be easy. All we have to do is get them to fight." And as I said to you, Chelmsford was making a deadly comparison. He deduced that fighting Amaxhosa and fighting Amazulu would constitute the same problem. And it was with this complacency in his breast that he arrived on the saddle of a strange sphinx-like mountain called Isandlwana. Itabale Isandlwana, that mountain looks like a little house. He arrived there on the 17th of January with a sergeant. They knee-halted their horses and they climbed up onto the shoulder of the hill. Now, anyone climbing up onto the shoulder of Isandlwana, I'm sure there's some in this room who have been. Is it the same lot who've been to Wilkesdrift as well? Yeah? You cannot help but be impressed by the view that must have impressed Lord Chelmsford that day. 70 square miles of unimpeded view off to the east, off in the direction of the Zulu capital, Ulundi, the direction from which the Zulu attack would come in that unlikely event, so he thought. He also knew that if he put a lookout on the top of the ridge to the north, which is out of picture, you need to imagine it over there, that man would be able to scrutinize 35 square miles to the north, and that if he put a lookout on the top of this little stony hill here, he could scrutinize 35 square miles to the south, and if he put a lookout on the western slope of Isandlwana, that man would be able to scrutinize 45 square miles back in the direction of Rorke's Drift. It was right on the old wagon track. The wagon track ran along in this image, right along over here. There was plenty of commanding high ground. There was an abundance of water in these, what in the winter are dry water courses, but in summer they're full of water. And then there was a plethora of firewood on the western slope of the hill, which is a huge boon in an environment which, as you can see, is naturally free of trees. What a magnificent spot this was, from a military point of view, for a temporary camp. And I put the emphasis on the word temporary, because Chelmsford only intended on being there for 2 days. Now, orders were sent back to his staff that the entire column was to move and camp at this spot. And they arrived on Monday, the 20th of January, 1879, and they set up camp on the gentle slope on the eastern side of the mountain. If you could imagine a huge white splash of army canvas, 3/4 of a mile in extent, neat rows of white tents, as only the British can do. Now, Chelmsford gets news on the 20th from his various black spies that the Zulu army had been summoned by the king on the 17th of January to the great military kraal of Nodwengu in the Valley of the Kings, and that they'd been addressed by him and they'd been sent out, and they could be expected to appear any day now in the hills off to the east and southeast of Isandlwana. What Chelmsford did not know, however, was what the actual brief of the Zulu army was. The Zulu army was briefed, as we now know, as follows. The warriors were told to march slowly, only 40 miles a day instead of the normal 60. They were told to conserve their food, which is a dried maize biscuit-like ration that they kept in sporran-like pouches on their kilts. It's a biscuit that forms on the inside of a clay pot or a cast iron pot where maize porridge is cooked. The Zulus call it isikoko. If anyone's ever had that, and I get a show of hands for those who've ever eaten it, it's absolutely delicious. We used to fight over it as children growing up in this part of the world. The warriors were told to nibble on it conservatively. The warriors were told that they were to repulse this invasion, but they were not to cross into Natal. Cetshwayo was adamant that he would maintain his ethics. He was being invaded, and it was simply his intention to repulse this invasion. Now, some of his warriors disobeyed him when they went on to attack the little mission station at Rorke's Drift, but that's another long story. The warriors were told that they were not to fight the British if they were fighting from prepared positions. They'd learnt the lesson from Blood River all those years before, but rather that they were to take the British force on in the open. They were going to give Lord Chelmsford the battle that he dreamed about. The warriors were also told, and there's quite a lot of the magic of the Battle of Isandlwana in this one, that they were not to fight on the day of the dead moon, which was fast approaching. Now, the whole concept of the day of the dead moon is an interesting one, and it has perplexed many people writing about this battle. It is simply the day when the sun and the moon are together. It happens every 28 days. It's like a Sabbath for the Zulus. They will not bury their dead on this day. They will not marry on this day. They won't plant any crops on this day. They won't slaughter livestock on this day. And they will not fight a pitched battle if they can help it on such an inauspicious day. Anyone know what event I'm talking about? Eclipse? New moon. And I'm glad someone said eclipse first, because I think it's a really interesting analysis of human psyche. Because you all knew that there was an eclipse in this battle. Well, a fair number of you would have known that there was an eclipse during this battle. And I start talking about the sun and the moon together, and you have this presupposition that I'm talking about the eclipse, but I'm not. I'm talking about new moon, because I threw in the caveat of every 28 days. And I think this has great bearing on something that will happen later on. And there are many Western societies as well that won't plant crops on that day, that won't slaughter livestock on that day. People believe that things won't grow if you plant them on that day. Now, isn't it interesting that in this battle, Isandlwana, Wednesday the 22nd of January 1879, which as it happened was the day of the dead moon, and we know that it was the day of the dead moon because when Captain Reginald Younghusband and his men of C Company, 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, had their backs up against the large rock up on the shoulder of the hill there was an eclipse of the sun. And you only get eclipses of the sun when the sun and the moon are together. And the soldiers of the 24th, many of whom were superstitious little Welshmen, didn't like this place. There was a sinister feeling in the air, they said. They didn't like the uncanny resemblance that the mountain had to the Sphinx that was featured on their regimental badge. The Sphinx had been incorporated into the cap badge of the 24th after they'd helped to defeat Napoleon in Egypt in 1801. And one gets a wonderful feel for the atmosphere in that camp if one goes and reads the letters that were written by soldiers in the ranks. Soldiers that were to die on this fatal field. These letters arrived back in their beloved Wales long after their disemboweled bodies had dried out at Isandlwana. They're in a book called The Red Soldier, if anyone's got it in their library, written by a chap called Frank Emery. Go and read the letters that were written by Owen Ellis from Carnarvon in North Wales and George Morris from Pontypool in South Wales. In fact, one man who got out said that he never felt such a strong presentiment of coming evil as he did on that day. So Chelmsford now, on getting news from his spies that the Zulu army had been sent out by the king, he was resolved that the next day, Tuesday the 21st of January, he was going to send out a reconnaissance in strength into the hills off to the east and southeast of Isandlwana. Just to do a bit of orientation here. We've got, there's the camp, or there is Isandlwana. We'll get to Durnford a little later and these things, forget about those. But out here off to the southeast is where Chelmsford thought that the main Zulu army would be. And Chelmsford's great fear in this, and it's well documented leading up to it, was that the Zulus would make use of all this broken ground. As you can see, if you look at the topography here, this is a very open, flat area leading off to Urundi, but very broken and deep gorges off to the southeast. So he was worried that the main Zulu army would cross the Buffalo River in some remote gorge and go and wreak havoc in Natal while he was stuck up in Zululand with these three cumbersome columns. And so the next day, the 21st of January, he sends out a reconnaissance in strength. 70 white mounted men under the command of an experienced colonial officer, Major John Dartnell was his name, and 1,600 NNC men. And they were sent to go and scour all those hills off to the east and southeast. And Dartnell goes off on the 21st, and he finds very few Zulus. And those that he did find then ran away. And Dartnell then split his force to look for the elusive Zulus. Very dangerous thing to do. And he was pounced upon by a large force of Zulus who attempted to surround him using their famous tactic of the horns of the buffalo. And Dartnell escaped by the skin of his teeth. And that night, while camped on the top of the Isipezi mountain, which is not actually shown on the map here, but you can see that these mountains of Mogogo, way off to his southeast, were becoming peppered with the bivouac fires of thousands of Zulus, and the inference was that he was up against the main Zulu army. So he sends a message back to Chelmsford at Isandlwana. Lieutenant Walsh brought the message in just after midnight on that fateful Wednesday, the 22nd of January 1879. Chelmsford was awoken by one of his staff officers with the message, "Sir, they found the Zulus." Chelmsford must have been absolutely excited by this news, and he summoned to his tent his staff officers. They huddled around one of the inefficient maps of the area under the inefficient light of an old oil lamp, and they made a decision in that tent, and there was a curse on this decision, and the decision was to split Chelmsford's force, to take over half the force out, to go and reinforce Dartnell out there, find the Zulus, and fight them. Now the book says that one must never divide one's forces in the enemy's territory until one has ascertained the precise disposition of the enemy's troops. Well, Chelmsford thought that he did know what the enemy's dispositions were. Dartnell was telling him, but Dartnell was wrong. Therefore Chelmsford was wrong. Therefore, indeed, they were all wrong. If I take you back 5 minutes in terms of presuppositions, if you think that the Zulus are going to cross this Buffalo River off to the southeast of you using that broken country, and all the information starts to point to the Zulus being out that way, what are you going to do? You're going to believe that information. He had no way of knowing that. So my personal view on it is that Chelmsford vilified in history for splitting his force. I think he did it for a fairly good reason. It just turned out to have the incorrect result from his perspective. Now, Chelmsford does make some amends for splitting his force. He summoned to his tent a young officer who was attached to his staff for transport duty. He was to become quite a famous figure in British military history. His name was Lieutenant Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien. And Smith-Dorrien was told to ride back along the track from Isandlwana to Vorster on a night so black he later remembered that he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. And he was told to summon to Isandlwana Lieutenant Colonel Anthony William Durnford, Royal Engineer, at the head of his mostly mounted, highly trained, hand-picked Basutus, and enter Colonel Durnford into our story. Now at 3:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd of January, the camp at Isandlwana, if I go back a slide, would have looked like a dull white blob on that pitch black landscape on that moonless night. The lion-like crag of Isandlwana would have been silhouetted up against the starlit sky. The scene was accompanied by the soft clink of saddlery and the crunch of thousands of steel-shod boots as Lord Chelmsford prepared to move out with over half the force. Now Chelmsford leaves behind at Isandlwana a brevet lieutenant colonel by the name of Henry Burmeister Pullain. You can't get enough of these names, can you? And Pullain is an interesting character. He was a thoroughly good and reliable officer. He'd been in this famous line regiment for 24 years, but he'd never seen a shot fired in action. This is not a criticism of Pullain, but I think it's just an interesting point. But I think what it may be telling us is that Chelmsford was taking his fighting officers out with him while leaving his good administrator behind to look after the camp. Now, in rather vague orders, Pullain was told to stay in the camp. He was told to look after the camp. And he was told to await instruction from Chelmsford to strike the camp. That is, to pack all the impedimenta onto the wagons. Isn't that a lovely word? Impedimenta. Because it's literally what it is. And they were to pack all the impedimenta onto the wagons and move it out to the new campsite that Chelmsford would identify during the course of the day. And it was now about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was going to be a very, very hot day. Those of you that have been into Zululand, you've been up there in the summer. It's as hot as Hades. And the men were having their breakfast in the camp. The camp would have run, if you look at this road, we'll leave this slide up for a while, that was the camp over there. And the men were having their breakfast. The lookout that was posted up onto the top, I'm going to bounce between these two slides because they're actually taken, it just would have been far too long to put it all into one, but the end of this slide over there is the start of this one over here. Is everyone happy with that? So I'm going to chop and change between the two of them. In fact, you can see the road running through it over there. So the lookout that was posted up onto the top of the 2C there then came in with a rather alarming message. So Colonel Pullain said, there are thousands of Zulus advancing in force towards the left front of camp. Now we're looking, so the camp was facing east, left front would be up in the northeast there. And Pullain sat down at his portmanteau and he penciled a note. This note actually survives. Today it's in the Barracks Museum in Brecon in Wales. I've had the privilege of holding that note in my hand. It reads, 8:05 a.m. Staff Officer, Sir, a report has just come in that the Zulus are advancing in force towards the left front of camp. He tore it off the writing block and he handed it to a dispatch rider, lucky boy, and he was told to take it out to the general. Verlaine then prevailed upon his staff officers to get the men to leave their breakfasts unfinished, and they were told to don their webbing, which contained ammunition pouches, which contained between 50 and 70 rounds of ammo per man, and they were told to take their modern lever action, breech loading Martini Henry rifles, and they were to form up in a firing line across the northeast quarter of the camp. So it starts over there in this picture. If we go around to the next one, it continues all the way along, just short of that donga, right the way to about there. And there were 1,000 men in that line, and the men stood between 3 and 5 yards apart. 600 of those soldiers were Imperial soldiers, and they stood there in their hot red serge uniforms and their steel-shod boots, and they faced that plateau, and nothing happened. The lookout returned to his position up on the top and looked out. He saw that there were no Zulus. He must have wiped his eyes and looked again. He then remounted his horse and he galloped back the 3.5 miles into camp here, and he reported this to Verlaine. He was then prevailed upon by his staff officers to allow the men to return to breakfast and return to camp. Now there was much unhappiness about the breakfast. The few men that got out tell us that it was now cold and inedible, but they hastened to mention that even when it was hot, it was also inedible. In any event, the men ate their breakfast with long teeth, and they were then told to form up again on that firing line. And these men had just got into their positions when there was a commotion on the saddle here. This is the wagon park, by the way. I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. But imagine into this area are crammed hundreds of wagons and thousands of oxen. And these are not these short wheelbase fighting wagons of the Boers. These are long wheelbase transport wagons. They run from here almost to the bar over there. Imagine something almost as long as a bus. And there was a commotion caused on the saddle here, and the commotion was caused by the arrival of our friend with his long moustaches and the withered arm. Anthony Durnford had arrived in the camp here. And Durnford dismounted. He was riding his beloved chieftain, and they wandered across this area of coal-bearing shale to Verlaine's tent, which had been in that area over there, and they had a late breakfast in the tent. And the conversation, we're fortunate to know from an officer called Cochrane of the 32nd Regiment who survived this battle. The conversation went something like this. Morning, Verlaine. Morning, Colonel Durnford. What's happening, Verlaine? Well, sir, a report has come in of a Zulu advance from the northeast. I've strung out a firing line to face that threat. I've sent a lookout to the top of the hill, and I've sent a message to the general. That's what's happening, sir. Now, as I said, you can forget about Durnford's politics, that he was pro-Zulu and anti any conflict with the Zulu. He was a soldier, and he would indeed behave like a soldier, and I think provide British military history with one of their greatest legends of all time, because Durnford thereupon asked Verlaine for 2 companies roughly 100 men, of his infantry soldiers, that he would take these 2 companies, and along with his mounted men, they would ascend the plateau to the north, find the Zulus, and fight them. And Verlaine demurred. He said no. His orders were to stay in the camp, and he intended on doing just that. But he said, but you, Colonel Durnford, are senior to me. Why don't you assume command and tell me what to do? The whole command structure of the camp was in confusion, because Colonel Henry Verlaine was a brevet lieutenant colonel. The word brevet props up quite a lot. It's effectively a battlefield promotion. So he's a major acting as a lieutenant colonel. Durnford, however, was a lieutenant colonel with a brevet of full colonel. So he was a full rank senior to Verlaine. And having told him that he would, suggested to Durnford that he should take command of the camp, Durnford typically backed down. He said, you stay in the camp, Verlaine, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to move out with all my mounted men. I'm going to head off in an easterly direction, keeping that conical hill to my left, and I'm going to drive a wedge between those Zulus that the lookout has seen to the north of the camp and Lord Chelmsford to the southeast, thereby protecting Lord Chelmsford's flank. Durnford had with him a rocket battery. Now, please abandon all thoughts of Apollo 11, Mark Shuttleworth, Elon Musk, etc. This is a primitive precursor of the mortar. It consisted of a simple metal trough with a bipod that one erected against it, and it fired a 9-pound rocket This rocket had a stabilizing flue which caused it to scream, and it was designed to explode case shot all over the primitive enemy, who would then be expected to down their primitive weapons and flee. Durnford had one of these. The instruction on this thing literally read almost as follows: when confronted by large numbers of advancing savages, you are to erect the bipod against the trough. Take a 9-pound Hale concrete rocket out of the box, arm it, place it in the trough. Pull the lanyard, which is a little piece of string which would activate the friction tube and set it off. Stand back then, for God's sake. And this was apparently a wildly inaccurate device, and there are historical records, but there was a pretty good chance that this thing would take off only to land back on your own head. Now, Durnford had one of these. The rocket was under the immediate command of Major Francis Broadfoot Russell. I always said if I had a son, I'd name him Broadfoot. Unfortunately, the gods didn't bless me with a son. I've got 3 lovely daughters, so I didn't have to name them something awful. And the rocket was, as I said, under the command of Francis Broadfoot Russell, and he had with him 1 bombardier and a small secondment of men of the 24th. And they were told off to drag the rocket to ascend the plateau at the notch just to the right of where the road runs today, and they were to take up a position on the Tusi, the highest point on the plateau. Durnford had also since decided, and it's long perplexed students of this battle, why between Pulaine and Durnford they had taken so long to come to this arrangement. And that was to send a patrol up onto the top of that plateau to see what was happening. Now, accompanying this patrol was a man who was to get out of this mess. His name was Raw, Charlie Raw, Lieutenant Charlie Raw. And Raw was to have a chilling experience, to put it mildly. Raw said that he and his men galloped up onto the top of the plateau, and they gazed out at the huge expanse of open rolling country to the northeast. They said they could see off in the distance a large herd of Zulu cattle being shepherded along by little Zulu herd boys, and they figured they might as well give chase. They might as well loot the cattle. And he said they'd been cantering along for some miles in the direction of these kids, and they weren't really concentrating, it being a hellishly hot day. And he said when they got to the spot where they thought that they'd seen the cattle and the kids, they looked up, and the cattle and the kids were gone. In open country, they had simply disappeared. Now, bells were ringing, and no one was listening. Raw and his men trotted up a little stony ridge on the top of that plateau, and it's really impossible to consider what then happened without feeling one's hackles rise. My God, they said, we had to rein in our horses to prevent them from falling into a steep ravine, and they stared aghast at what was in this ravine. He said, below and beyond them, stretching along the course of this Ingwebini stream, off in an easterly direction as far as the eye could see, packed in there, squatting in absolute silence on their great war shields, regiment by disciplined regiment, were the Zulus of the main Zulu army. It must have been quite a moment. Raw and his men dismounted from their ponies, and with their Swinburne Henry carbines and their Martini Henry rifles, they fired into this packed mass. There was a reaction of fright, particularly from those young warriors of the Umtlicho regiment, those young warriors that had yet to bathe their assegais in the blood of an enemy. They'd been calm up until this point, and they screamed, Husutu! And they raced forward, and they had to be restrained by their chiefs. Remember, it was the day of the dead moon. They were not supposed to fight on this day. But the Zulu commanders knew that the element of surprise had now been lost, and that this was the moment to attack. And they made a decision there and then. And the Zulus started to stream out of the head of this ravine, and Raw and his men remounted their ponies and began to fall back the 5.5 miles back to Isandlwana. Now, back in the camp, everyone was, or with Raw's first shots, I should say, the Battle of Isandlwana had begun. Back in the camp, everyone was blissfully unaware of the drama that was unfolding now 6 miles off to the north. And we know a little bit about this, again, thanks to the testimony of another of the 5 officers that survived this battle. His name was Gardner, Captain Alan Gardner, from that famous regiment, the 14th Hussars. And Gardner had just arrived back in the camp with a message from Chelmsford to Pulaine advising him to strike the camp, that is to pack the wagons and begin to move out to the new campsite that Chelmsford had identified. And Pulaine and Gardner were standing in the mouth of Pulaine's tent when they looked up at that plateau to the north. They saw a lone horseman coming off the skyline with the speed of the clappers Within minutes, he'd reined in his horse in front of Pauline's tent. He was out of breath and in a state of mortal funk. His name was Shepstone, George Shepstone, the son of the famous Sir Theophilus, and he blurted out the unbelievable news that the main Zulu army was not off to the south and to the east where Chelmsford was blundering around looking for it, but that it was to the north and to the east. And at this very instant there were 25,000 Zulu warriors in full regalia and full formation about to hit this camp. Pauline's reaction, we believe, was one of lack of reaction. He simply sat down at his portmanteau and he penciled another note. Heavy firing to the left of our camp. Cannot move camp at present. Signed, H.B. Pauline. Hardly conveys any sense of urgency at all, does it? Now, almost in an act of insubordination, Captain Gardner penned a second note, advising Major Cleary on Chelmsford's staff that Raw and his Basutos were falling back on the top of the plateau here, that calling for reinforcements, and that the entire British force was strung out about a mile in front of the camp. In other words, the line was too far out. These messages were given to a dispatch rider, another lucky boy, and no, there weren't two men called Lucky Boy. I got asked that once by a guest on the battlefield. What a coincidence that there were two men, both dispatch riders, both given messages, both called Lucky Boy. Anyway, that's not the case, I'm afraid. These messages, alas, reached Lord Chelmsford long after the Battle of Isandlwana was over. So just so we're aware where we are at this point, I know for those at the back this might be a little difficult to see, but we've got the camp at Isandlwana, the red blocks of the tent, that's the firing line out there. Durnford is headed off to the southeast. The rocket battery is almost at the top of the hill. There is Raw and his men falling back ahead of the Zulu army. And then two companies of men were placed up onto the top of a low ridge on the Motu Plateau, which we believe was a very intelligent move to cover this broken ground off to the northwest of Isandlwana. We're unhappy with where we are at this point in the battle. Now Pauline and Gardner again, sorry, gone the wrong way, were standing again in the mouth of his tent, and they looked up at the skyline to the north of the camp. They saw a thin black snake coming off the skyline at the notch. They picked up their glasses and they saw, my God, that the snake was made up of Zulus and that the snake had a head. And the snake was making straight for that rocket battery that was still toiling up the lower slopes of the plateau there. One can only imagine what it must have been like for Major Francis Broadfoot Russell and his men. Well, chaps, we've got the advancing savages. Erect the bipod against the trough, take a rocket out of the box, arm it, place it in the trough, pull the string and stand back. They managed to loose off one rocket, which exploded in the midst of the Zulus, but the Zulus never flinched. This was a different enemy, this one. The Zulus said they didn't even slow down. They said we just hacked at the men left and right. In fact, 3 men managed to survive this battle by playing dead out there. They were lucky the Zulus were in such a hurry. And they watched the snake getting longer and thicker. They watched it curl around the back of that conical hill. And within minutes, and it was minutes, and Lord Chelmsford was right when he said treat the Zulus like cavalry, for heaven's sake, that's how fast they moved. They could hear the dim crackle of rifle fire coming from 4 miles east of Isandlwana. Durnford was engaged. Now Durnford had with him a number of colonial officers who survived this battle. So one would therefore think that the most lucid account of what happened to Durnford in this battle would come from the pen of a white man. We couldn't be more wrong. The most moving and I believe complete account of what happened in this battle, or what happened to Durnford in this battle, comes from the pencil of one of his beloved black sergeants. Simeon Kambula was his name. And he records in his stilted English what then happens. He said, the Zulus came at us across the plain, and our colonel, and we loved this man so much. And this pathetic little epithet continues in almost every paragraph. He ordered us to dismount from our ponies, loop the reins through our elbows, and fire into the advancing Zulus. We killed them by the 100, but those brave men just kept on coming until they were so close that our colonel ordered us to remount our ponies, fall back, dismount once again, loop the reins through our elbows, and fire again into the advancing Zulus, who kept on coming. So a tactical withdrawal was made by Durnford, a series of retreats and stands as Durnford retired obliquely towards Isandlwana until he reached a donga, which is over there. Dry watercourse for those who are unaware of what a donga is. And he used it as though it were a giant trench. He lined the men up in the donga, and Durnford was now in a very, very strong position. And there he pinned the Zulus. And the Zulus took cover in an abandoned Zulu village, and in the maize fields, which you can still see, are there to this very day. And Durnford was giving them a pounding. Jabez said he was walking up and down the line. He was laughing and joking with the men. He said the rifles of some of the men were jamming. The primitive coiled brass cartridge would frequently get stuck in the breeches of these rifles when they got hot, and the extracting claw would fail to extract the spent cartridge properly. Durnford would go up to the most junior private soldier who was having trouble with his rifle. He'd take the rifle from the man, he'd place it between his knees, and then with a flick from his good hand he would extract the spent case. He'd slip a new one into the breech, he'd close the lever, hand it back to him, he'd pat him lovingly on the back, he'd say to him, "You fire away, my boy." Oh, we loved this man. Kambula said everything was under control. Now back in the camp, everyone's attention was absolutely riveted on what was going on down there in Durnford's Donga. There were 6,000 men fighting down there, and the Zulus were obviously getting a severe drubbing. One survivor then tells us that he noticed that there was some activity on the top of the low ridge on the knuckle of the firing line here, where the 2 7-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery had been placed. One of them was being prepared for a sighting shell. There was a great explosion, and the shell arced out across the field, and it landed smack bang in the middle of that abandoned Zulu village, blasting those poor souls that were taking cover in there to kingdom come. The sighting shell had been spot on. And of course a cheer, or several shells followed, and everything was under control, and there was a cheer that rang out across that British firing line. And the cheer was, 3 cheers for the Royal Artillery, hip hip hooray. And again, in the camp here, we're very fortunate that people interviewed survivors of this battle, one of whom was a captain at the time who was out with Chelsea. His name was William Penn Simons. He, as it happened, was the first British general to lose his life in the Great Boer War at the Battle of Tulana. And he interviewed a man who got out of this mess, and he gave him some more of the magic of the story. The man told him that he was in the camp. He said he was absolutely focused on what was going on down here in Durnford's Donga. But then he said something prevailed upon him, and he turned his head. He was to get the fright of his life. He said the whole range of hills, the Motu, its entire length, of 3.5 miles, suddenly, in an instant, became covered in dense black masses as the main Zulu army stepped out onto the skyline north of the camp. The Zulus choreographing their arrival and using the topography to achieve exactly that effect. They pull their shields out to the side, instantly giving the impression that their numbers had doubled. It was part of their tactic. They were now thumping the shafts of their assegais into the leather of their shields. They were stomping their feet with great stomps. This man said it almost seemed to shake the earth. Isandlwana has little change for those who've been there. It's one of those precious places where if you fuzz your focus just a little bit and allow oneself to be carried along by the story, you can walk off the field of Isandlwana not just with a feeling of what it must have been like out there, but indeed with a feeling of what it was like. Henry Pauline then receives a message from one of those 2 companies that were up on the top of the ridge to the north of the camp. The message was, "Colonel Pauline, sir, there's a great mass of Zulus that is separated from those up on the plateau. They're moving down the valley that moves away from Isandlwana to the northwest. We've been firing into this packed mass for some time, and we've not managed to elicit any response from them at all." I think this message must have perplexed Pauline. Zulus moving away from Isandlwana? If Pauline was perplexed, and we'll never know if he was, I don't think he remained perplexed for too long, because a short while later the lookout that was posted onto the western slope of Isandlwana came hopping and skipping down all these rocks and boulders down to Pauline's tent, and he blurted out a message that must have sent a shiver down the spine of Henry Pauline. "Colonel Pauline, sir, there are thousands of Zulus astride the road to Rorke's Drift. And I think it was at this point that the penny with Queen Victoria's head on it came crashing down on the toe of Henry Pauline. My God, the horns of the buffalo. That force just described was the right horn of the Zulu army. The mass up on the plateau was the head and the chest of the Zulu army, and the force against Durnford and the Donga was the left horn of the Zulu army. And I put it to you that up until this point, the British High Command never believed that the Zulus would be able to deploy their tactic on such a grand scale with the horns over 5 miles apart. I also put it to you that for far too long we've painted this battle as a British blunder. And the time has come for us to consider this battle for what it really was. It was a great Zulu victory. And it's high time that we arrogant English-speaking white people learn to duff our hats to people like Nchingwayo Gamahole Khoza, the Zulu commander-in-chief. There he sits up on those huge rocks up there at Inyoni. He was in his early 70s. He was a big-boned, impressive man. He'd run the whole way from Ulundi with his men. Can you imagine what that did for the morale of the Zulu army? They were cutting great swathes through the grassland that were still visible 6 months later. This was his day. Do you know the history books give this man 2 lines? For inflicting arguably the greatest defeat that Britain was ever to suffer, these 500-page tomes that are written on this battle. 2 lines. And yet people like Dartnell, Durnford, Chelmsford, Pauline get chapters written about them. When Nchingwayo saw that the horns of his buffalo were in position, he rose up to his impressive full height, and smiling at his indunas around him, he clenched his fists and he shouted, "I saw me, Aingene, Hele! We've got them, 2 arms, let's go." And the command then rippled out that those grandsons of Shaka could now descend down into the killing field. The few men that got out tell us that the Zulu descent at that plateau was orchestrated with a precision that would have done justice to a military tattoo. And I need you to see this huge sea of black lapping up against that thin British firing line. Oh, I've gone too far, my apologies. And then a strange thing happened. Or perhaps it wasn't such a strange thing. That British line held. Now, you know, there's a popular misconception in this country, some of you will know this word very well, that the British soldier was a Royneck, that he was a redneck, that he was an anemic fellow, that he was imported into this country, and that on any prolonged exposure to that big orange ball in the sky, he turned into an amorphous heap of sunburn. We couldn't be further from the truth. The men of the 1st Battalion, those men on the firing line, 24th Regiment of Foot, had been in this country since 1875. They'd arrived in Cape Town. They then marched from Cape Town to Kimberley to quell the Black Flag Rebellion. By the time they got there, it had quelled itself. They were then told to turn right and march to King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape, where they fought and won the 9th Frontier War in, as I said, very difficult conditions in the Amatola Mountains and the Prairie Bush. These men had marched over 1,000 miles in this country before they'd even fired a shot. The lucky ones were then shipped from East London to Durban. The unlucky ones had to march all the way up the coast. We don't call it the Wild Coast for nothing, do we? They'd arrived in Durban in mid-1878. They then marched from Durban to Pietermaritzburg to Greytown, Greytown to Tugela Ferry to Helpmekaar to Rorke's to Isandlwana to die. These were no Rooinecker. Many of them were short, bronzed, bearded little Welshmen that came from an industrially depressed Wales. Anyone seen How Green Was My Valley? That beautiful thing that Llewellyn did on the depression in Wales. That's why many of them took the shilling. There was nothing for them in the valleys. Do you know that there was no left and right boot for soldiers in the ranks? There was one boot that you had to mold to the shape of your feet, a steel shod boot in that terrain. These men would swill their boots out with urine every morning to change the pH levels, to keep the leather soft, to prevent athlete's foot. They were good men. Also in those days, a tour of duty was 5 years. They should have been on ships on the way home. Instead, they were standing there on the hottest day imaginable against the toughest army that they'd ever faced. They should have been back home. They were good men, and they were giving the Zulus an awful pasting on that firing line. And we certainly believe that this battle very nearly went the other way. This was very nearly a British victory. I think if my family has made any contribution to this saga, it's that we've assimilated a great deal of the Zulu oral tradition concerning these events into this story. You know, for too long, I think the story of this battle has been told by the loser. Now, surely, isn't that the case? Might is often right. You get the chance. If you win the battle, you get to write the history. Not in this case. Now, when my parents were building the little lodge at Fugitives Drift, my father had a great friend called Mnandi Ngobese. Mnandi's dead. He died in October of 1993. And with his death, a whole era has passed. I was so privileged as a little whippersnapper to be allowed onto the field of Isandlwana with this old man. The Zulus have the most wonderful way of speaking about their history in the first person. Just to give you an idea of the age of this man, he didn't know how old he was. He had one tooth. And his father was Mehloga Zulu Gaschaya, one of the men who had dragged the two women through the river and stoned them to death. And they would load him up into the old pickup truck, my father and Mzonjan and Panza, and they would always drive out onto the field of Isandlwana, and they'd walk out onto the little knuckle on the ridge where the two 7-pounder guns had been placed. And I've still got this vivid memory in my head as a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid, following this man. And as he got onto the field of Isandlwana, his back would straighten, and he'd stride out like a colossus. He had the dignity of Mahatma Gandhi, did this man. And he would sit them down, and sit us down amongst the large rocks, and it wasn't long before we were listening to that great warrior chieftain, Mehloga Zulu Gaschaya himself. The story is then told in the first person. Instead of it being my father, I was there. And we were transported into the midst of this battle by this old man. And he said beyond that spot where the guns were, there was a swale, a flame, a depression, what we would refer to in military speak as dead ground, ground that you have to be on top of to fire into. If you can't see into it, you can't fire into it. It's why the firing line was so far out. And the Zulus were taking cover in the long grass there. They were being killed hand over fist by British rifle fire. Then a strange thing happened. One of the chiefs, the Induna, the commanding officer of the Umqicho regiment that was taking such a pasting in this dead ground, stood up right at the back, and he came striding through these terrified young warriors, exposing himself recklessly to British bullets. And he turned around and he shouted at these terrified young warriors, "Yay, Nina," he shouted, "Ningabalegi, Mhlambana wabulalila kashongo njalo." "Hey, you over there, don't you dare run away." The little branch that extinguished the fire, one of Tetwaya's praise names, never told you to run away. I remember as we watched, and this old man would weep when he told this story. A British bullet struck Mkhosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan right between the eyes and killed him in his tracks. And he said, so struck were we Zulus with what had happened, or what this old man had done for us, that after he'd been killed, not one Zulu moved back 1 inch. And I can remember my father coming home. We weren't with him on the day he first heard this story, and him struggling to relate what had happened, saying how they had to leave Old Nandi sitting on a rock, his hands around the top of his ancient stick, his chin resting on his hands, eyes closed, tears streaming down his withered old face. They had to leave him there and let him recover. They, of course, had to recover too. And then they came back and they helped him to his feet. All that energy, all that dignity was now gone. He was spent. And they helped him back to the vehicle. They drove away in silence, left him with one of his young wives. What he'd just driven home to my father in his sensitive way is that we seem to be preoccupied with how our history pivots on the actions of a few people. Lord Carnarvon, Bartle Frere, Chelmsford, Dartmoor, Durnford, Pullane. He told this old man that it was his intention to tell this story to people who he hoped would come to hear it. And this old man was now telling him, he said, you promise me, my boy, that you will never ever tell this story without telling people who the real hero of this battle was. He was Nkosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan. it was because of him that that Zulu line held. It's a promise that my father kept to this old man until the day he died. It's a promise that we'd like to keep to this old man too, because I think it's important to tell the story in as balanced a way as possible. Again, I want you to imagine this huge sea of black lapping up against that thin British firing line. There's Durnford down there in the donga. Durnford's still in the strong position, but it's at this point the few survivors tell us that the rate of fire that was being delivered by Durnford down in the donga started suddenly to diminish. They were rummaging through their pouches. They were running out of ammunition. And Durnford sends a Basotho horseman with 2 empty saddlebags up onto the saddle of Isandlwana, and with instructions for the quartermaster to send a mule cart full of ammo down to Durnford's position out in the donga. And this Basotho horseman arrives up on the saddle. If I go to the next slide, imagine this area again, thousands of oxen and hundreds of wagons. And in the confusion of this, of course, Durnford's wagons having arrived there, this man couldn't find his wagon. And he sees Quartermaster James Bloomfield of the 2nd Battalion, 24th, calmly handing out packets of ammunition to his men, and exhausted and exasperated, this Basotho helps himself to these cartridges. The quartermaster sees him, and he remonstrates with him. He says, "Hey, don't take that, man, for God's sake, it belongs to our battalion." And Smith Dorian, who was a witness to this, shouted at him. He said, "Hang it all, quartermaster, you don't want a requisition now, do you?" And with that, Quartermaster Bloomfield fell dead with a bullet in the brain, a spent Zulu slug that had somehow arced across the field. And we'll never know if that Basotho horseman managed to get his ammunition down to Durnford in the donga. And I put it to you that it doesn't really matter. It's an interesting part of this battle is that one of the major reasons it's cited as a great British blunder is that apparently they didn't pack enough screwdrivers to open the ammunition box. I find that one quite hard to believe, that an invasion of this scale could unravel at the seams because they haven't packed enough of these screwdrivers to open the ammunition boxes. I think they're quite easy to open. The Zulu accounts tell us that all they did is they picked up the ammunition box and dropped it on a rock, and it would open. The other thing that this incident with Bloomfield and the Basotho horseman, I think, is often given a little more credit than it deserves in terms of why it all went wrong. Because Durnford's men mainly carried .577 Enfield Schneider carbines. The men of the 24th had .450 Martini Henry rifles. You can't swap the rounds around between them. So whether Bloomfield knew this or not is another story, but it's just part of the whole fabric of the story. History tells us that Durnford retired from his position because he was running out of ammunition. We think he pulled out of there for a far more pressing reason. Do you think a military commander of the caliber of Nchingwayo up there on the ridge to the north, that he failed to see that between Durnford's donga and the little stony hill south of Isandlwana, there's over 2,000 yards of completely undefended terrain? Of course he saw it. And his warriors were instructed to get around Durnford's right. So Durnford was now threatened with being cut off by those Zulus. So Durnford gave the command to his mounted infantrymen to begin to fall back towards the camp. Unfortunately, though, Durnford's timing was poor. But this was not Durnford's fault, because at this point, Lieutenant Charlie Pope, out here on the firing line, and he had with him 172 men, at this point had not been engaged by the Zulus, and he took it upon himself to take his men off the line to go and reinforce Durnford down there in the donga. And at that very moment, Durnford pulled back. But he could fall back. He was mounted. But Pope wasn't. And Pope and his men were slaughtered where they stood. The Zulus remembered Pope. They said, he had 3 eyes, they said. Pope wore a monocle. That's how accurate the Zulu accounts are of this battle. When Major Wilson Black returned to Isandlwana to effect the burial of these dead men 4 months later, they wandered down the old rutted wagon road for 1,000 yards until it cut the first dry watercourse. Here these men duffed their Glengarry caps and they wept at what they saw. there were 67 skeletons lying, touching in one heap. And some of them were still clad in their tattered red tunics of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, the brass sphinxes on their collars turning green with corrosion. Pope was history. Now Durnford retires back towards Isandlwana. Oh, sorry, let me go back a step actually. Behind Charlie Pope's position on the line there were 3 detachments of Natal native contingent under the command of Colonels Lieutenants Barry, Stafford, and Lonsdale. And when this untried and untested force of NNC men saw this 172 men of Pope's men being wiped out in front of them, they understandably broke and fled. And they started to move in a panic-stricken shuffle up onto the saddle of Isandlwana. That area was full of civilians, cooks, clerks, cleaners, bandsmen, bottle washers, wagon conductors, and medical personnel. And the momentum of their meeting carries this force of black and white over the saddle, and they looked out into the valley west of Isandlwana, and what did they see? Zulus. Thousands of them. And even as they watched, the warriors of the Umbulbe regiment separated off that right horn and closed in on them, and they got caught. These were the fugitives, many of them white men, overweight white men, and they were very quickly caught and speared by the athletic warriors. But the black soldiers of the Natal native contingent were just as fleet of foot as their Zulu counterparts, and they managed to get all the way down to the Buffalo River, where these poor souls had Hobson's choice. The Buffalo River was in flood, so it was death by drowning or death by the big broad-bladed assegai. Meanwhile, Durnford retires in good order, and just out of the wagon park, just out of the tented camp at the base of this little stony hill south of the saddle, right there in fact, he made his famous last stand. He formed his British square. Durnford shouted at the men around him. He said, "Don't run, don't run. You can't run from these people. I know them well. Come and stand with me." The 48-year-old Durnford must have taken great solace in the last moments of his rather unhappy life that the soldiers that flocked to him, and indeed died in heaps around him, were some of his greatest critics. They were the soldiers of the Natal Carbineers, those that had abandoned him all those years before in the Bushman's River Pass. And we suspect that it was at this point when Durnford entrusted the reins of his beloved horse chieftain to his 2 sergeants, Jabez Mulifi and Simeon Kambula, and told them to take the 70 Edendale contingent men, and they were trying and hold the high ground to the north or to the south of the saddle. Durnford knew that he had to keep this area free of Zulus if any men were to stand a chance of getting out of this battle alive. Jabez said that they tugged at his sleeve, they remonstrated and they begged him to come with them. And Durnford turned to Jabez and he said, "Jabez, you don't understand. I'm a soldier. It is my duty to stay here with my men, and it is my duty to die here with my men." Jabez said that they led this horse back all the way back to Pietermaritzburg, believe it or not. They wouldn't ride it. And they got up onto the little stony hill to the south, and they looked back, and there he was, still laughing and joking with his men. They looked down the valley, they could see that it was choked with Zulus. They knew that holding that position would be pointless, and they made their way down the fugitives' trail and ended up surviving this battle. There's so many stories though that emanate from the death of Anthony Durnford. My grandfather's old friend George Bunting, those of you that came up to the little talk I did up at Fairview a few months ago, I spoke a little bit about George Bunting, but George Bunting grew up in very impoverished circumstances on the top of the Kuteni Mountains, the highest point in Zululand. And George was always, when he was sent off to school at age 11, it was a 100-mile horse ride from the family farm at Kuteni to the railhead at Glencoe to catch the train to Durban to go to school. He was always chaperoned by an old Zulu warrior who wore a head ring and a kaross. His name was Shezi, and Shezi had fought at Isandlwana, and they'd always camp up on the shoulder of the hill. It was halfway on their trip, and it was the magic of this old Zulu storytelling ability around the campfire that was to mold this baby Bunting into one of the greatest white authorities on the Zulu nation that there has ever been. Because he got the story from the horse's mouth. This old man tells the child that there was this knot of British soldiers surrounded by this hostile sea of Zulus. He said they were absolutely exhausted. The British had run out of ammunition and they'd resorted to taking their knives, their bayonets, and they'd fixed them onto the ends of their rifles. And he said, hell hath no fire like a British soldier with a bayonet fixed. He said, and we warriors had exhausted all of our throwing spears and resorted to picking up the bodies of our dead comrades and throwing them onto the bayonets of these rifles in an effort to get them down so that they could get in there with their big broad blades. This old man tells the child that he manages to fight his way clear of the Zulus. He finds a dead British soldier lying on his side. He turns him over. He finds a rifle. He rummages through his pouches and he finds 2 cartridges, and he works out how this complicated lever action firearm functions. He said he managed to get back up into the front. He said the number of British soldiers had diminished in his absence. He slips a cartridge into the breech, he closes the lever, and he looked down the barrel of his gun into the face of a man, and he pulled the trigger, and he killed. And he expressed sorrow at this. He said it was not the Zulu way to shoot a man down like a dog. Not to shoot a man when he couldn't shoot back. It was the Zulu way, to stab him, to always give him an equal chance of killing you back, the ultimate fight, to always ensure that the best man wins. And this young child understood that this old man was trying to atone for what he'd done, and he accepted the apology on behalf of the dead soldier, which pleased his old friend no end. This story again is then picked up by Mnandi Ngobese, whose father, Natal Zulu, commanded a wing of the right horn of the Zulu army, those that were engaged with Durnford. And he tells us that there was a cry at this point from a great barrel-chested warrior called Sitwele Twele Gamhlekele. And it's another one of these shouts that was a rallying cry for the Zulus for many years to come. Hey Nina! Nenzani lapha! Mhlamvana wabulamila kashongo njalo. Hey you over there. That's why I never ordered us to dally like this. Get on with it. And he said these Zulus then rose up with that great cry of Usutu, and they fell on Durnford and his men. And it was history. Durnford's death was immortalized in a sketch done for the graphic newspaper At Bay, it was entitled. And the caption records that the last order we heard given was, fix bandits, boys, and die like British soldiers do. And of course, so they did. And most of the Zulus remembered Durnford. They said he was one of the last to die of that square. He was a tall, good-looking man, they said. He was laughing and joking with his men, and his left arm was withered and held in a sling at his side. Those same Zulus said, those red soldiers at Isandlwana, like lions they fought, and like stones they fell, each man falling with a thud, like a stone, in his place. To go back a few steps here. So, at this point now, Durnford has retired and is history. Remember right in the beginning of this battle, Durnford says to Pauline, I want you to keep your firing line extended and support me. Now that Durnford has fallen back into camp here, Pauline can get his firing line back into the camp. Smith Dorian said, above the row of battle I heard a bugle sound the retire. And the bugler with his lips a quiver sounds this retire. The Zulus said they heard one of those copper things that you British people use to make noises. And the British started to fall back. And it was, again, such a privilege to hear this story from Mnandi and Zulu, this language with all its alliteration and rhythm and rhyme. And he said, Yithi, abantu abamnyama, sasukuma njenge igagasi elikhulu elimnyama lasolwandle. What a beautiful language. He said, we rose up like a great big black wave of the ocean, we rose up, and we fell back with them. And the dribble of white stone cairns on the battlefield today is telling you the story. You can see out on the firing line, let me find you a slide with the cairns on it. I'll be going back and forth there quite a bit. So, the firing line is in that shot, over there. See how few of those little white dots there are? Look how many there are over here in the camp. The cairns are telling us a story of a tactical withdrawal that failed. And it failed for a number of reasons, but the main one was that you couldn't move a tactical withdrawal through a tented camp, the tents of which were still erect. That's why you struck it. Standing order in the British Army at the time, that in the event of an infantry attack on one's camp, you were to kick the pole out and lay the canvas flat on the ground. Don't give your enemy cover in your own camp. This was never done at Isandlwana. The Zulus said they got the upper hand when they got into the camp. They'd push a British soldier into the wall of a tent. A warrior would nip around the back and open the tent with a slash of the assegai and stab him through the wall of the tent. They knew when they'd got him because the white would turn scarlet. And it was into this bloody bedlam that Henry Polaine stepped into his tent one last time to fetch out the Queen's colour. And in a very moving little ceremony, as a nameless witness in a Natal newspaper afterwards said, he said to him, "The Queen's colour, you are to take it to a place of safety and Godspeed, and God be with you. Go." And Melville began his epic ride, which for him sadly was to end in tragedy down at the Fugitives' Drift. Meanwhile, Captain Reginald Younghusband and his men of C Company, 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, had fought their way up intelligently onto the shoulder of the hill. There's a reason why they were the last men to die. It's the strongest position on this battlefield. One can only imagine what he must have seen. They would have seen Durnford die. They would have seen that the track back to Rorke's Drift was choked with Zulus. They would have seen Henry Polaine entrust the colour to Melville and send it off the field because there was no hope. It was an immediate state of surf keeper, alia jacta est. It was over. The Zulus said they noticed an officer with his men clustered about the large rock on the shoulder of the hill. They said they bounded up towards them. One of them then said the sun, then went dark like night. The eclipse started. We know that this event started at 10 minutes past 1. One of the Indunas then ordered his men to wait. "Yimani," he said. And they let this British officer shake hands with all his men. Then they said he pulled a great knife from his belt, he wheeled it around his head, they came screaming down at us, and we killed them all. The Zulu said they then descended down into the camp. They described the terrible orgy of destruction that was going on in this camp. They then noticed that one British soldier had crept into a small cave high up on the mountain. It's over there just behind that tree. They said he didn't blaze away hurriedly. He'd obviously ordered some cartridges. He was taking careful and deliberate aim. He killed a Zulu man with every single shot. The Zulu said they then broke open ammunition pouches, or ammunition boxes, so much for the need for screwdrivers. They stuffed their pouches full of them, they bounded up the hill, they fired away at him, and only after a long time had passed did they kill him. And again they expressed sorrow at this. They said Captain Esbeen is cool. He was a man of great courage. Samhloni Pimpela. We really respected him. Then the Zulu said they turned and they noticed that the shadow of the Isandlwana mountain had touched the plain. The eclipse was over. That man in the cave might have been alive hours after the second last man died. 1,329 men on the British side lay dead. 52 officers were killed in this battle. More were killed here than were killed at Waterloo. It's arguably the greatest defeat that Britain was ever to suffer in her entire colonial history. The number of Zulu dead will never be known. We believe it to be in the region of 3,000. There could have been 4,500 bodies lying about the Sphinx Mountain that afternoon. And I think the saddest part of the whole story is what the Zulus had to say of this battle. Petwayo, the king, said of Isandlwana, he said Sakwas was Siswed, a great assegai had been thrust deep into the belly of the nation. This was a Pyrrhic victory. He knew that the warriors of the Ngoma Makhosi, the Mbonambi, and the Umqicho regiments would never, ever fight properly again. He also knew that all the overtures for peace that he'd been making prior to the outbreak of this war would now be met by the rebuttal that peace? You want peace? Go back to Zululand and we'll bring you peace. And peace can only come now from the barrel of the .450/577 Martini Henry rifle. It was the beginning of the end for the Zulus. It was their finest hour, and it was also their darkest hour. And I think it's inappropriate to what if this battle? What if Chelsea had not gone out? What if Durnford had not gone out? What if Henry Polaine had understood the threat that he was under and he pulled his men up onto the shoulder of the hill, having struck the camp? What if Nkosana Gamvundlana of the Biela clan had not given his life for his people? Who knows? Perhaps Benjamin Disraeli would have been elected to another term. It doesn't really matter. And one doesn't have to be a great military authority to appreciate the error that was made by the British on this day. The scouting that let that huge Zulu impi get so close to the camp at Isandlwana. Communication between senior officers leaving a hell of a lot to be desired. But underpinning the whole saga is that inescapable fact that they had underestimated the Zulus. And one must never, ever underestimate one's enemy. And I believe that the whole ethos of this great Victorian battle piece, arguably the finest battle piece of this whole era, is beautifully summed up on an inscription borne on a memorial which, as it happens, stands not far from where our friend with his long moustaches and the withered arm breathed his last. In its own way, and with a few words changed here and there, this inscription pertains to each and every man, black or white, Zulu or Basotho, Englishman, Welshman, or South African colonial who died on the field of Isandlwana that day. It reads, not theirs to save the day, but where they stood, falling to dye the earth with brave men's blood, for England's sake and duty. Be their names sacred among us, neither praise nor blame add to their epitaph, but let it be simple, as that which marked them up alive. Tell it in England, those that pass us by, that here, faithful to their charge, her soldiers lie. Ngabo, thank you all very much for a bit long. I know, it's been playing for 2 hours. I didn't think I'd spoken for that long.
I don't think anybody else could have spoken and tell the tale as well as Andrew Ratway has done. Andrew, thank you very much. I want to give you something from the Van Historical Society.
Oh, thank you.
And also to mention to everybody here that on the 9th of June at the Country Club, Andrew will be talking about the sequel to this, Rorke's Drift.
Thank you very much.
Let's open the we were talking about ammunition, and there's an animal that's got scales, and you're going to see it now, that has its own defense. What do you think it is before ammunition? Pangolin.
Thank you very much.
You can now have refreshments, and all the tapas is coming through. I think they've been trying to come through while you were talking, but we've overstepped the time limit. So please help yourself, and they'll come around and hand around trays.